12 years. I had waited 12 frickin' years for this particular moment. There's nothing I have ever wanted more than to kiss his lips. Those damn soft lips. I knew he wanted it too. I could see it in his eyes. I gently caressed his cheek with my left hand and tugged his lower lip free, which he had been unconsciously chewing on all this time. He let out a small, nervous laugh, and I smiled. "David," I whispered, leaning in, closing the gap between us. Honestly, at this point, I could hardly hear my own voice over the beating of my heart. As I felt him melting in my palm, my lips crashed onto his. I closed my eyes, savoring the taste of him, the warmth of his mouth against mine. It was everything I imagined and more. I felt like I was floating like every moment of the past 12 years that had led to this. Suddenly, I heard footsteps rushing toward us. Before I could react, someone shoved me aside. I stumbled back, eyes wide with shock. "How dare you, Daniel?" the newcomer shouted, his voice filled with rage. Before I knew it, he slapped David right across the face. "What the hell?" was all I could yell at that moment, as I stood there stunned. This was not how I imagined things to be. 12 years ago. "Do you have to go?" I mumbled to him, my voice barely audible. We were sitting in our favorite spot under the big oak tree in my backyard. It was the place where David and I had spent countless hours talking, laughing, and dreaming about the future. However, despite this being our happy place, neither of us was happy today. David looked at me, his eyes red from crying. "Andrew, I have to go. There's nothing I can do about it." I clenched my fists, trying to hold back my own tears. "But why, David? Why do you have to leave? This isn't fair." "My mom's gone," he said quietly, staring at the ground. "I have to go live with my dad and my brother. I don't have a choice." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. David's mom had always been so kind to me, and now she was gone. And with her gone, David was being taken away too. It felt like my whole world was falling apart. "I hate this," I muttered, kicking at the dirt. "I hate that you're leaving. I hate that I can't do anything to stop it." David reached out and put his hand on my arm. "I know, Andrew. I hate it too. But we have to be strong. We'll see each other again. I promise." "How can you be so sure?" I snapped, pulling my arm away. "What if we never see each other again? What if you forget about me?" "I could never forget about you," David said firmly. "You're my best friend. You're more than that. You know that." I looked at him, my heart aching. He was right. David was more than just my best friend. He was the person I cared about most in the world. The thought of losing him was unbearable. We sat in silence for a while, the reality of the situation sinking in. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. "I don't want you to go," I whispered, my voice breaking. David leaned in closer, his face just inches from mine. "I don't want to go either," he said softly, "but we have to make the best of it. We'll write to each other. We'll visit when we can. And when we're older, we'll find a way to be together again. Promise?" "Promise." 1 year ago from now. "What do you mean they moved away?" I asked, exasperated, as the tiny old woman squinted her already tiny eyes at me. I had just pulled up into an old neighborhood, where David and his family last lived before I stopped receiving letters from him. The place looked a bit run down and quiet, matching the description from one of David's letters. But now that I was here, he was nowhere to be found. It had been 11 years since I last saw David. We promised each other we would find a way to meet, and I was determined to keep it. The old woman squinted at me, clearly trying to place me. "Harris? Oh, yes, I remember them. They used to live just down the street, but they moved away a few years ago." My heart sank. "Moved away? Do you know where they went?" She shook her head. "Sorry, dear. I'm not quite sure. They packed up and left rather suddenly. I think they moved to another state, but I don't remember exactly where." I sighed, feeling helpless. "Do you remember anything else? Maybe the name of the state or city?" She thought for a moment. "I believe they moved to somewhere in the Midwest. I'm not really sure. I know they had some family there, but that's all I can recall." okay, thanks, I said, trying to keep my spirits up. I appreciate your help. As I walked away, I couldn't help but feel a bit disheartened. It wasn't the concrete answer I was hoping for, but it was a start. I got back into my car and made a mental note to look into places in Illinois and Indiana. I drove around the neighborhood a bit more, hoping that maybe someone else would know more. I saw a few kids playing in their yards and a couple of people tending to their gardens. I approached a man who was working on his car, hoping he might have some information. "Hello, excuse me," I called out. "I'm trying to find some information about the Harris family that used to live in this neighborhood. Do you happen to know where they might have moved?"
"Harris family, huh? I remember them. They were nice folks. I think they moved to a place with a funny name, like Glenwood or something."
"Glenwood?" I repeated, jotting it down. "Do you remember what state that might be in?"
"Yeah,"
he said, scratching his head.
"Glenwood. I think there are a few Glenwoods around. Could be in Illinois, maybe."
"Thanks for the tip," I said, feeling a bit more hopeful. "I'll check that out." I drove around some more, searching for any other leads. I stopped at a local diner and struck up a conversation with the waitress, who advised me to meet the librarian of the local family, as the woman from the Harris family were friends with her. I heeded the advice and met the librarian, who turned out to be a nice woman but didn't have the information I was looking for. Then, before leaving the town, I decided to stop by the community center, just in case. I spoke up with a few people there, explaining that I was looking for David Harris and his family. Unfortunately, no one had any concrete information, but they did suggest contacting the local school district in Glenwood because they last heard his father was working there. Feeling both hopeful and exhausted, I headed back to my car, ready to make some phone calls and do more research. The search was far from over, but I felt like I was finally making some progress. The thought of possibly finding David again kept me going. 3 weeks before the present day, I had finally made it to Glenwood. The drive was long and tiring, but as I pulled into the small town, I couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement. I was here. I was finally going to see David again. I'd followed up on every lead and every clue, and now, all I had to do was find him. The town was quiet, with tree-lined streets and cute little shops. I parked my car, and as stupid as it sounds, I decided to start by walking around the town square, where I hoped I might spot David. I can't explain the excitement I felt in my heart as I strolled through the streets, my eyes constantly scanning the crowd for any sign of him. And then, I saw him. I couldn't believe my eyes for a whole minute. It felt like a cruel trick, but it wasn't. He was really there, walking down the street, casually chatting with a friend. There was no mistaking it. Even though we had not seen each other for 12 years, I could recognize those familiar features. That same smile I had missed for so many years. My breath was caught in my throat. I had finally found him. I walked quickly but carefully, trying to stay out of David's direct line of sight. I wanted this moment to be perfect. I approached him from behind, trying to gather my courage. "David!" I called out, a bit out of breath. David turned around, his eyes narrowing as he took in my face. For a moment, he looked puzzled.
"Yes? Can I help you?"
"It's me, Andrew," I said, stepping closer. "Andrew, I came all the way here to find you." David's eyes widened, and he took a step back, disbelief written all over his face. "Andrew? No way." He looked me up and down, and then a look of recognition slowly dawned on him. "Andrew! Oh my god, it's really you!" He grinned a mix of shock and joy on his face. "I can't believe it. How did you find me?" "I've been searching for you for ages," I said, my voice full of emotion. "I heard you had moved here, and I didn't stop until I found you." David's face lit up with happiness. "Wow, I never thought I'd see you. I mean, again. This is incredible." We hugged tightly, and it felt like no time had passed at all. It was as if we had picked up right where we left off, even though so many years had gone by. "Let's catch up," David suggested, a big smile on his face. "There's so much I want to hear about your life, and I want to tell you everything that's happened to me." David told me about his life since he moved here, how he had adjusted to his new school, his family, and the challenges he had faced. I shared my own story, the years of waiting and searching, and how much I had missed him. As the days went by, we hung out more often, exploring the town, going out for dinners, and catching up on everything we had missed. It was like we had never been apart. The connection was still there, and it was strong as ever. We laughed together, shared stories, and slowly grew closer. He felt a bit different from before. I couldn't quite put a finger on it, but he was different. But whatever it was, I liked it better. One evening after we had gone to see a movie, we walked back to David's apartment. It was a clear night, and the stars were shining brightly. We talked about the film we had just watched, exchanging our thoughts and opinions. "And did you see that punch? The one that directly hit its jaw?" he asked me excitedly. "Yes, that was really something. I liked the scene where they combat in the air. I held my breath through that scene." He laughed as I enacted myself holding my breath through the scene. "I'm really glad we did this," David said, looking at me with a soft smile. "I've missed you so much, Andrew." "I feel the same way," I said, my heart swelling with emotion. "It's like we've picked up exactly where we left off." Suddenly, he stopped at a quiet spot near a park. The only light there was the faint glow from the close-by streetlights. I couldn't see David's face, but it seemed like he wanted to say something, but hesitated. "There's something I've been meaning to tell you," David began, his voice a little uncertain. Before he could continue, I took a step closer and looked him in the eyes. "David, you don't need to say anything. I know. I love you too. I've always loved you." His eyes widened in surprise. I could see the mixture of shock and joy on his face. I leaned in, closing the distance between us, and kissed him softly. Back in the present time. "What the hell?" It was all that came out of my mouth as I was shoved aside and the man I kissed got slapped right across his face. For a moment, I felt like as if I had lost my mind as I watched two Davids at each other's throats. Each looked like the spitting image of the other. "Who? What?" I stammered, unable to form a coherent thought. The perfect moment I had waited 12 years for was shattered in an instant, leaving me standing in the middle of a chaotic mess, trying to understand what the hell had just happened. And then, like a train, it hit me. He called him Daniel. Of course, they look alike. One of them was Daniel, David's identical twin. But that means that the one I just kissed was not David, but Daniel. And all this while, I had been hanging out with Daniel? Or was it David? Maybe Daniel only came today? A few other times? Maybe. Who was who then? Who had I been talking to and hanging out with all this while? Who had been the one I said I love you to just now? Who did I just kiss? All these thoughts were too much for me. So, without saying anything, I just left as the two brothers fought amongst themselves. A week later, every day like a ritual, I had been checking the status of the earliest train out of the city and back to my town, since I saw the two brothers fight. Today was no different. I was lying on my back, scrolling through the train chart, when I received a call from an unknown number. "Hello?" I answered. "Hello. Hi, Andrew. This is David," came the response from the other end. Before I could stop myself, the word escaped my mouth. For real? I guess the bitterness was still deep-rooted in me, but it still didn't explain why hadn't I been able to leave the city in the past week. "Yes, Andrew, it's really me this time. Look, I'm sorry for whatever my brother did, but please let me make it up to you. Please just meet me today." The voice on the other line continued. I don't know. I didn't even know what to say, but thankfully I was cut in mid-sentence. "Please, Andrew, I've waited for 12 years too. Don't punish me for what my brother did." David pleaded. "Okay, let's meet," was all I could say, but I guess that's all David wanted to hear because his voice instantly went from pleading to really chirpy as he promised to make it all up to me and drop me the address and meet-up time. I should be happy. I was finally meeting my best friend, the one I had loved and missed for so long. Yet I could feel nothing inside as I watched the text, "Hey, I'll meet you at the park near your hotel tomorrow at 9. Can't wait," with a weird hollowness in my heart. The next day, David and I met as we decided on text. It was a bit awkward at first, but things soon got to ease up between us. He apologized once again for everything Daniel did, but I dismissed it, saying that none of it was his fault. Of course, this David knew a lot more about our childhood. He'd bring up things I had completely forgotten, and it was like we were reliving those carefree days all over again. After that day, we started to hang out more often than I had anticipated. One sunny Saturday, we visited the local school where his father taught. The swings there looked a bit more worn out, but just as inviting. Remember when you tried to do a backflip off of a swing and ended up with a sprained ankle? David asked, laughing. I laughed too, shaking my head. Yeah, I thought it was so cool. My mom was furious. She made me stay in bed for a whole week. David grinned. You were always trying to impress everyone with your stunts. And I was right there, egging you on. As we walked further, we came across an old tree house clearly built by some kids. You know, the one we built is still there. Wow, it's still there? David asked, clearly not able to believe it. I nodded, looking up at the treehouse with a nostalgic smile. We spent so many summers there, hiding from the world, sharing secrets, and making plans for the future. We climbed up carefully, the wood creaking under our weight. Once inside, we sat down on the rough wooden floor. It was like stepping back in time. Do you remember that time we tried to build a rocket? David asked, taking a sip of his soda. I groaned, laughing. How could I forget? We almost burned down your garage. Your dad was ready to kill us. David laughed, shaking his head. He was so mad. But then he helped us build a model rocket that actually worked. That was one of the best days. After that, we went for dinner, where David instinctively ordered my favorites and we dug in, still talking and laughing between bites. It was like we had traveled back to our childhood, where everything was simple and fun. After dinner, we walked back to my place. Andrew, David said softly, breaking the silence. I'm really glad we found each other again. I turned to look at him, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. Me too, David. I missed this. I missed us. David smiled, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. But a nagging confusion was still there, lurking in the back of my mind. I pushed it aside, focusing on the here and now. We stayed out on the porch for hours, talking about our dreams, our fears, and everything in between. It felt like no time had passed at all, like we were still those two kids with the whole world ahead of us. As the night wore on, David finally stood up, stretching. I should probably get going. It's getting late. I nodded, standing up as well. Yeah, you're right. Thanks for today, David. It was amazing. David grinned. Anytime, Andrew. Let's do this again soon. He hugged me tightly, holding on a little longer than necessary. When we finally pulled apart, there was a lingering sadness in his eyes that I couldn't quite place. Good night, Andrew, he said, giving me one last smile before walking away. Good night, David, I replied, watching him disappear into the night. As I stood there on the porch, the weight of my feelings crashed down on me. I had waited so long for this, for him, but why did it feel like something was missing? Why couldn't I stop thinking about Daniel? Frustrated, I headed inside with my mind still caught in the whirlwind of emotions. I knew I needed to sort this out, to figure out what I really wanted. But for now, I was just grateful for the time we had spent together, for the chance to relive our childhood and remember what it felt like to be truly happy. A week and a half later, David and I had been hanging out together for over a week now. It felt like we were trying to make up for lost time, squeezing in as many moments as we could. Today, we decided to spend the afternoon at a local fair. The place was buzzing with people, bright lights and the smell of fried food wafting through the air. We wandered around, playing games and laughing at our failed attempts to win stuffed animals. David was especially determined to win a giant teddy bear for me, and after several tries, he finally managed to knock down all the bottles in one go. Got it! He shouted, grinning as he handed me the bear. I laughed, hugging the bear. Thanks, David. You're a pro at this. We continued to explore the fair, eating all sorts of ravishing foods and trying out different rides. Eventually, we ended up at the Ferris wheel. As we climbed into the carriage, the sun was starting to set, casting a golden glow over everything. Andrew, look, how beautiful it is. David said, looking out at the view. Yeah, it is. I agreed, feeling a warmth spread through me. It was one of those perfect moments you wish could last forever. As the Ferris wheel slowly churned, David reached out and took my hand. I glanced at him, surprised. Andrew, he started, his voice soft. I've really enjoyed spending time with you. It's like nothing has changed between us. I squeezed his hand, smiling. Me too, David. It's been amazing. David leaned in a little closer, his eyes locking onto mine. There was a moment of silence, the world around us fading away. I could tell he was about to make a move, something more romantic. But just as he leaned in, I don't know why, I gently pulled back. Look at the view on the other side, I said, pointing out at the horizon. Isn't it beautiful? David hesitated for a second, then smiled, following my gaze. Yeah, it really is. We continued to chat, the conversation flowing easily. But then, without even realizing it, I mentioned Daniel. Soon we got off the wheel and went towards the food court. Look, cotton candy. You love them. Let me get them for you, I happily exclaimed. You know I hate the texture. David replied with a look of disdain on his face. But you... As I tried to refute, my smile faltered a bit and so did David's, and there was an awkward pause. I quickly realized my mistake but tried to brush it off. Anyway, I said, trying to steer the conversation back. What was your favorite part of the fair? David didn't answer right away. He looked thoughtful, his eyes clouded with something I couldn't quite place. Andrew, can I ask you something? Of course, I said, my stomach nodding a little. Do you still think about Daniel a lot? He asked, his voice careful. I hesitated, unsure of how to respond. I mean, sometimes he's your brother, and I spent quite a bit of time with him. David nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. I understand. I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. I'm sorry, David. I didn't mean to bring him up. It's just, I guess I'm still trying to process everything. David squeezed my hand, his eyes softening. I understand. It's a lot to deal with. I just wanted to know where your head's at. We walked in silence for a while. The perfect moment had a shadow cast over it. It wasn't ruined, it was just different. As we got off the ride and continued walking around the fair, the conversation gradually returned to normal. We laughed and joked, but there was still a lingering tension between us, something unspoken but understood. That night, as we walked back to the car, David stopped and turned to me. Andrew, I want you to know that I'm here for you. Whatever you're feeling, it's okay. We'll figure it out together. I nodded, grateful for his understanding. Thanks, David. I appreciate that. We hugged, and for a moment, everything felt right again. But as we drove home, my mind kept drifting back to Daniel, and I knew I had a lot to sort out before I could truly move forward with David. The week with David had been amazing, but it also made me realize that I couldn't ignore my feelings any longer. I had to figure out what I wanted, not just for myself, but for David too. He deserved that much. 3 days later. I was running late to meet David. My phone buzzed with a "we need to talk" text from him earlier, and it had been gnawing at me since. Traffic was terrible, and I kept checking the time, feeling the pressure increase with each passing minute. I finally parked and practically sprinted to our meeting spot. David was waiting for me at a small park bench. He looked up as I approached, giving me a small, tense smile. I could tell something was on his mind. Hey, sorry I'm late, I said, trying to catch my breath. It's okay, he replied, patting the spot next to him. Sit down. I sat down, feeling a little uneasy. I asked him what he wanted to talk about, but he ignored it and started talking about his day, asking me about mine, anything but he wanted to talk about. I could tell that he was just as nervous about the conversation as me. Then, out of nowhere, David turned to me and asked, Andrew, do you love Daniel? I stared at him, shocked. What? What are you talking about? David looked down, almost regretting his question. I'm sorry for jumping to conclusions.
It's just, I know you, Andrew. I can tell when something's off.
I tried to gather my thoughts. David, I came here to find you. I looked everywhere. Went through so much to be here with you. He nodded, but his eyes were sad.
I know, and I appreciate that. But even though you're here with me, it feels like a part of you isn't. I feel like you're not really here.
I felt defensive. David, I spent these amazing days with you, and it was incredible. But then I realized it wasn't you. It wasn't your fault, but neither was it mine. David shook his head, his voice calm.
I'm not saying it's your fault. I just can't keep pretending everything's okay when it's clearly not. You need to figure out your feelings before it starts hurting either of us.
I didn't know what to say. My mind was a mess. I thought finding David would be the answer to everything, but now it felt more complicated than ever. David took my silence as his answer and leaned in to kiss me on the cheek. It wasn't like his usual kisses. This one felt like a goodbye.
Think about what I said, Andrew.
I watched him walk away, my heart heavy. I sat there for a while, trying to make sense of everything. It was clear that I needed to sort out my feelings, but it wasn't going to be easy. Later that night, I couldn't stop thinking about our conversation. I replayed it over and over in my head. Was David right? Did I have feelings for Daniel? The more I thought about it, the more confused I felt. 2 days later. I had spent the past 2 days tossing and turning in my hotel bed, yet I could reach no conclusion. Furious and frustrated, I dropped a text to Daniel asking him to meet. I was still confused and conflicted about what I was going to do once I talked to him, but I knew I needed answers. Can we meet? I need to talk. I typed and hit send before I could second guess myself. His reply came quickly. Sure. Where? We agreed to meet at an old abandoned church on the outskirts of town. It was a place where we could talk about interruptions, somewhere secluded where we could have some privacy. I arrived first. The place was too silent and it only amplified my agitation. I paced back and forth, my mind racing with everything I wanted to say. When Daniel finally arrived, he looked nervous. He walked up to me slowly, hands in his pockets. Hey, he said softly. Why did you do it, Daniel? I blurted out, unable to contain my frustration any longer. Why did you lie to me? Why did you betray me? He looked down, unable to meet my eyes. I don't know. I'm sorry for everything I did, he said quietly, turning as if to leave, but his words only fueled my anger. Sorry? That's it? I shouted, my voice echoing off the old stone walls. I waited 12 years to meet David again, to be with him. Just one tiny thing, and you ruined it all. Daniel flinched at my words, but didn't move. He finally looked up, pain evident in his eyes. I know I messed up, Andrew. I know, but you don't understand. Then make me understand, I yelled, cutting him off. Make me understand why you thought it was okay to deceive me like that. He took a deep breath, struggling to find his words. I spent 12 years listening to David talk about you. Day and night, he'd go on about how great you were, how much he missed you. It was like you were this perfect person my brother found, one I could never have. I stared at him, my anger starting to mix with confusion. What are you talking about? Before I knew it, I started waiting for the day I'd get to see the boy my brother couldn't stop talking about. Daniel continued, his voice breaking. And when I finally saw you, I couldn't help but want you for myself. I wanted to tell you the truth, but I was scared I'd lose you. And by the time I decided to come clean, you had already kissed me. Things went downhill from there. I was speechless, my mind reeling from his confession. So you're blaming all this on me? I asked, my voice shaking with anger. You're saying it's all my fault? No, Andrew, Daniel said, shaking his head. I'm not blaming you. I'm just telling you my side of things. Why are you even here? You know the truth. I made a mistake, but you have David now. Why aren't you happily living with him? Why are you wasting your time with me? His words hit me hard. I want to, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. I would much rather be with your brother than stand here and listen to a liar. But I can't help missing you every time I'm with David. I can't help but remember all the time we spent together. I don't even understand why I can't stop thinking about you. This is all your fault. Before I could understand my own thoughts, before I could even consider stopping myself, I rushed toward him and kissed him. When we finally pulled apart, Daniel had tears in his eyes. I can't stop thinking about you either, Andrew, he said, his voice raw with emotion. If you feel the same way about me as I do about you, why don't we give this a chance? I'll show you how much better I can be for you than my brother. I shook my head, torn between what I knew was right and what I felt. This isn't right, Daniel, but it wouldn't be right to ignore our feelings either. We stood there, looking at each other, the weight of our situation hanging heavily between us. Finally, I took a deep breath. Let's give it a chance, I said softly, but we need to be honest with David. He deserves to know the truth. Daniel nodded, relief washing over his face. Okay, we'll tell him together. We hugged, holding on to each other tightly, knowing that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but determined to face it together. As we walked away from the church, I couldn't help but think about how complicated everything had become. Finding David was supposed to be the happy ending to my long search, but now it just felt like the beginning of a new, uncertain journey. Conclusion. It was difficult for me to tell David the truth, and I guess it was even more difficult for David when Daniel and I told him the truth. I asked for his forgiveness and requested if we could still remain friends. I guess that was selfish of me, but I didn't want to lose my best friend even though I didn't see him as a romantic interest anymore. To both our surprise, David agreed but requested for some time first. I knew things were going to be messy, but in my heart, I knew what I felt for Daniel and am willing to face anything as long as we can be together. After all, we had made mistakes and we had hurt people we cared about, but we also had found something real, something worth fighting for. The end. Have you ever been stuck in a sibling love triangle? Thanks for watching. Consider subscribing to become a part of our rainbow force, and stay wholesome.